In Christianity, it's commonly believed that Jesus' resurrection proves he's divine. But have you ever stopped to ask, why would coming back from the dead automatically mean someone is God? The connection between resurrection and divinity isn't as obvious as it might seem. In fact, it did not come out of nowhere. It was shaped by cultural influences, especially from Persian and Greco-Roman worldviews. Different cultures have their own take on what it means to rise from the dead. That's right, Christianity isn't the only tradition that talks about people coming back to life. Many ancient cultures do. But interestingly, in some of those traditions, resurrection isn't always a good thing. In today's episode, we are going to look at why early Christians believed Jesus' resurrection confirmed his divine status, and how ideas from Greco-Roman mythology may have shaped the way the resurrection story was told. Hello my friends, this is Shen at Mindful Living. Welcome to my channel. I used to be a Christian, and not just a casual believer, but a full-time minister. I know the teachings of the church well, including the parts that often get left out. In this video, I'll be sharing some historical and cultural insights that might be new to you, but they are based on solid research and historical records. Whether you are a Christian or just someone curious about ancient history and religion, stick around. I think you'll find this fascinating. Let's start with an example from the East to show how other cultures view resurrection. In Chinese philosophy, especially Taoism and Confucianism, life and death are seen as natural parts of a cosmic cycle. Taoism teaches that we should live in harmony with nature, following the flow of yin and yang. A core principle in Taoism is Tao follows nature, 道法自然, which means we shouldn't go against the natural order of things. From that point of view, trying to reverse death or bring someone back to life would actually disturb the balance of the universe. Similarly, Confucianism talks about the mandates of heaven, or tianmin, which refers to a kind of cosmic will or destiny. Trying to undo death could be seen as defying that mandate and risking chaos. Some Taoist texts even warn against tampering with life and death. For example, in Taiping Jing, it says, heaven has its constant way, it must not be defied, or calamity will follow. So in Taoism, life and death are part of a bigger cosmic design. If someone were to come back from the dead, it might not be seen as a miracle, but as a bad sign. A walking dead person could be considered a disturbance to the natural order, even a bad omen. Now, there are old stories in Taoist folklore about people who could bring the dead back to life. These individuals were usually seen as mystics, practicing secret arts like internal alchemy. But even then, those practices were considered strange or dangerous, not something regular people should mess with. I'm not bringing up this alternative view of resurrection to say it's better or more correct. I'm simply showing that resurrection doesn't always mean the same thing in every culture. In some traditions, it's not even seen as a good thing. So when early Christians interpreted Jesus' resurrection as a sign of divine power and status, something to be celebrated, that wasn't the only way it could have been understood. That interpretation was shaped by the cultural world they were part of. Resurrection wasn't a brand new idea in first century Palestine. Jews at that time were already familiar with stories of people coming back to life. In the Hebrew Bible, for example, the prophet Elisha performs 2 resurrection miracles. In 2 Kings chapter 4, he brings the Shunammite woman's son back to life. Later in chapter 13, there's a wild story where a dead man is thrown into Elisha's tomb, and when the body touches Elisha's bones, the man comes back to life. Now, whether or not you believe these stories really happened is a separate question. Personally, I see them as legendary tales that were meant to highlight Elisha's spiritual power. But if you believe they are historically accurate, I'd be genuinely curious to hear why. Feel free to leave a comment and share your reasoning, but I digress. The point is, resurrection stories already existed in Jewish tradition before Jesus. And the pattern continues in the New Testament. Jesus himself raises people from the dead, most famously Lazarus. But notice this, nobody calls Lazarus divine. Nobody bows down and worships him. These kinds of stories were understood as signs of God's power working through a person, not proof that the person was God. So when we talk about Jesus' resurrection, we need to make a distinction. Stories like Lazarus are better described as resuscitations, people brought back to life only to die again later. Jesus' resurrection is different. According to the Gospels, he doesn't just come back to life, he ascends to heaven and never dies again. And that part, the ascension, is a key detail. It's not just the resurrection that made people see Jesus as divine, it's the fact that he rises from the dead and is taken up into the heavens. That had powerful meaning in the Greco-Roman world. But before we get into that, we need to talk about the Jewish idea of the end times, or what scholars call eschatological resurrection. In Second Temple Judaism, the period just before and during the time of Jesus, resurrection wasn't seen as a sign of someone being divine. Instead, it was mainly understood as an eschatological event, something that would happen at the end of time, when God would raise the dead as part of his final judgment and the restoration of the world. This idea of a final resurrection wasn't actually present in the earlier parts of the Hebrew Bible. It started to develop much later, likely influenced by ideas picked up during the Jewish exile under Persian rule. You see, the official religion of the Persian Empire was Zoroastrianism, and it had a powerful end-time vision called frashokereti. This was the belief that one day the world would be completely renewed, evil would be destroyed, and all people who had ever lived would rise from the dead. They would be reunited with perfect, youthful bodies and live forever in a restored, flawless world. Here's a passage from the Zoroastrian Yasht, a set of hymns.
We sacrifice unto the awful kingly glory made by Mazda, that will cleave unto the victorious Saoshyant and his helpers, when he shall restore the world, which will, thenceforth, never grow old and never die, never decaying and never rotting, ever living and ever increasing, and master of its wish, when the dead will rise, when life and immortality will come, and the world will be restored at its wish, when the creation will grow deathless, the prosperous creation of spent among you, the good spirit, and the druge, deception, shall perish, though she may rush on every side to kill the holy beings. She and her hundredfold brood shall perish, as it is the will of the Lord.
This vision is strikingly similar to the Jewish concept of resurrection that developed later, and it's hard to claim that Zoroastrians borrowed it from Jews, because earlier Jewish texts, especially the Torah, don't contain anything like it. Most scholars agree the idea of a final resurrection in Judaism was likely influenced by the dominant Persian culture during that time. Of course, you don't have to accept that if you don't want to. But at the very least, it's important to understand that Jewish beliefs about the end times didn't form in isolation. It's also worth noting that not all Jewish groups in Jesus' time believed in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees, who held tightly to the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, rejected the idea because resurrection isn't mentioned there. On the other hand, the Pharisees did believe in it, and since they were more popular among the general public, their teachings had a stronger influence, especially on early Christian communities. Even the Apostle Paul, before becoming a follower of Jesus, was a Pharisee, so it's very likely he already believed in the resurrection of the dead long before his conversion. With all this background in mind, it makes sense that the early Christian claim about Jesus' resurrection wasn't immediately dismissed or laughed off. Instead, it was taken seriously, especially among Jews who already believed in a future resurrection at the end of time. In fact, Paul's letter to the Corinthians reflects this very idea. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul describes Jesus' resurrection as the first fruits, the first sample of what's coming for everyone who believes.
But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. But each, in turn, Christ the first fruits. Then when he comes, those who belong to him.
So what Paul is saying here is this: Jesus' resurrection wasn't just a one-time miracle, it was the beginning of the end, the first step in what Jews were already expecting, a final resurrection and the arrival of a new age. Some Christian apologists argue that first-century Jews weren't expecting a resurrection in the middle of history, and that's technically true, but they were expecting it at the end of history. So when Jesus was said to have risen, early Christians saw that not as a strange break from expectation, but as a sign that the end time had begun. Paul even calls his generation those who are living at the end of the age, 1 Corinthians 10:11. Now here's something interesting. While the message of Jesus didn't gain much traction in Palestine, it began to spread throughout the Roman Empire. First among Hellenistic Jews, those who had adopted the Greek language and culture, and then among Gentiles or non-Jews. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written in Greek, not Hebrew or Aramaic, and they were written for Greek-speaking audiences. So it's no surprise that the Gospel writers used concepts and imagery from Greco-Roman mythology to communicate who Jesus was. And we can actually see this influence in how the resurrection stories are told. For example, Jesus' resurrection was understood by early Christians not just as a miracle, but as proof of his exalted status, that God had vindicated him. Remember, in the ancient world, crucifixion was seen as a humiliating death, a sign of being cursed. But by raising Jesus from the dead, early Christians believed that God had reversed the verdict. Paul puts it this way in Romans 1:3-4.
Concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord.
Paul reinforces this idea of Jesus' resurrection as the divine promotion in Philippians 2:5-11. Let's take a look.
Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
This passage lays out a pattern: humiliation, obedience, death, and then exaltation. Jesus lowers himself all the way to the cross, and because of that, God raises him up, giving him the highest honor. This pattern, descent followed by a divine vindication, is deeply familiar in the Greco-Roman world. So where else do we see this idea of someone being lifted up by the gods after suffering or death? A lot of places, actually. One of the clearest examples is the myth of Heracles, known as Hercules in Roman tradition. Heracles was a demigod who endured tremendous hardship, including the famous 12 labors, as a form of penance. But his greatest trial came at the end of his life, when he was betrayed and poisoned by his wife Deianira. In unbearable pain, he built his own funeral pyre and stepped into the flames. But this wasn't the end. Zeus intervened, rescued him from death, and brought him to Mount Olympus, making him fully divine. In other words, Heracles' painful death became the gateway to immortality and exaltation. His resurrection wasn't just about survival. It was a public statement from the gods. This one is worthy of honor. This pattern would have felt very familiar to Greek-speaking audiences. And when early Christians told the story of Jesus, his suffering, death, and resurrection, many would have seen clear parallels. Like Heracles, Jesus was raised not just to live again, but to be vindicated and glorified. And Heracles isn't the only example. Consider Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome. According to the historian Livy, Romulus was speaking to his soldiers when a sudden storm came. A dark cloud enveloped him, and when the storm passed, he had vanished. People believed the gods had taken him up to heaven. In this story, we see the same structure: a mysterious death or disappearance, followed by divine resurrection or ascension, and finally deification. One especially interesting detail in the story of Romulus is what happens after his mysterious disappearance. According to Livy, Romulus later appears to a Roman nobleman named Proculus Julius. What Romulus tells him is strikingly similar to what Christians know as the Great Commission, the moment when the resurrected Jesus gives his disciples a mission. Here's what Proculus Julius says.
At break of dawn today, the father of this city suddenly descended from heaven and appeared to me. Whilst, thrilled with awe, I stood rapt before him in deepest reverence, praying that I might be pardoned for gazing upon him. Go, said he, tell the Romans that it is the will of heaven that my Rome should be the head of all the world. Let them henceforth cultivate the arts of war, and let them know assuredly, and hand down the knowledge to posterity, that no human might can withstand the arms of Rome.
Sound familiar? In Matthew 28, the resurrected Jesus says, All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. Just like Romulus, Jesus is said to appear to his followers after rising from the dead, and then gives them a divine mission that involves global impact. For those in the Roman world, this kind of story format, resurrection followed by heavenly commission, was already recognizable. Now, let's look at another fascinating example, Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine. Asclepius started out as a mortal. He was the son of Apollo and a human woman named Coronis. From Apollo, he inherited divine gifts, especially the power to heal. But Asclepius took this gift even further. Ancient myths say he became so skilled that he could raise the dead, but that kind of power didn't sit well with the gods. Zeus saw this as a serious threat. If humans could cheat death, it would upset the natural order of things. So Zeus struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt, killing him. But even that wasn't the end of the story. Later, Asclepius was resurrected and transformed into a god. In some versions, he was placed in the sky as the constellation of Heracles, the serpent bearer, a symbol still used in medicine today. Asclepius' resurrection wasn't just a reward, it was a form of divine vindication. Though he was punished for overstepping mortal limits, the gods ultimately acknowledged his greatness by raising him to a place of honor and worship. Like the story of Jesus, Asclepius' return from the dead symbolized not just restoration, but elevation to divine status. In both stories, Asclepius and Jesus, we see that resurrection can mean more than just returning to life. It can mean being lifted up, glorified, and even declared divine. Interestingly, this idea of post-death appearances and miraculous acts wasn't just found in myths. It was also part of what people in the ancient world actually believed. Even Origen of Alexandria, one of the early church fathers, acknowledged this in his writings. In Against Celsus, Book 3, Chapter 24, Origen responds to a critic named Celsus, who tried to dismiss the resurrection of Jesus as silly. Origen pushes back, pointing out that many Greeks claimed to have seen the resurrected Asclepius, not as a ghost or hallucination, but as a real active presence who healed people, did good deeds, and even foretold the future. Here's what Origen writes.
When it is said of Asclepius that a great multitude both of Greeks and barbarians acknowledge that they have frequently seen, and still see, no mere phantom, but Asclepius himself, healing and doing good, and foretelling the future. Celsus finds no fault when we express our belief in such stories, but when we give our assent to the disciples and eyewitnesses of the miracles of Jesus, who clearly manifest the honesty of their convictions, we are called by him a set of silly individuals.
Origen is pointing out the double standard. If Greeks can believe in a resurrected healer like Asclepius without ridicule, why mock Christians for believing Jesus rose from the dead? But at the same time, by making that comparison, Origen is also admitting that stories of resurrection weren't unique to Christianity. Other cultures had similar claims. And it doesn't stop with Asclepius. In another work, his commentary on the Gospel of John, Origen mentions a different resurrection story. He refers to a Samaritan figure named Dositheos, who also claimed to be the Christ. His followers believed he didn't die, but instead remained alive somewhere, possibly awaiting return. Origen writes,
Just as Jesus arose from among the Jews, not only saying that he was Christ, but also demonstrating it, so also a certain Dositheos arose from among the Samaritans and declared that he himself was the Christ who had been prophesied. To this day there are Dosithians derived from him, who bring forward books of Dositheos and certain stories about him, describing how he did not taste death, but is alive somewhere.
If even rival messianic figures were believed to have risen from the dead, this shows how common such narratives were, even outside the Jewish circles. Now, to be fair, it's not entirely clear whether Dositheos was actually considered divine by his followers. The sources mainly say he was believed to have never died. But there's another Samaritan figure we know was seen as divine, and we have a pretty striking record of it. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, tells us about a man named Simon, a Samaritan from the village of Gitto. This is most likely the same Simon we read about in Acts chapter 8, often referred to as Simon the Magician or Simon Magus. Here's the exact quote from Justin's First Apology, chapter 26.
There was a Samaritan, Simon, a native of the village called Gitto, who in the reign of Claudius Caesar and in your royal city of Rome did mighty acts of magic, by virtue of the art of the devils operating in him. He was considered a god, and as a god was honored by you with a statue, which statue was erected on the river Tiber between the two bridges, and bore this inscription in the language of Rome: Simoni Deo Sancto, to Simon the Holy God. And almost all the Samaritans, and a few even of other nations, worship him and acknowledge him as the first god.
So what do we take from this? In the ancient world, claims of resurrection weren't that unusual. People expected divine figures or chosen ones to overcome death or be taken up into the heavens. Whether it was Heracles, Romulus, Asclepius, or even Dositheos, resurrection was a recognizable symbol of divine approval, vindication, or even deification. Now, do I personally believe that these Greek legends are historical? No, of course not. But that's not really the point. What is important is that these kinds of stories were part of the literary and cultural tradition in the Greco-Roman world. It was customary to describe beloved or heroic figures as being taken up into the heavens and made divine at the end of their earthly life. This wasn't seen as odd. It was actually a respected way to honor someone after death. You could almost think of it as a cultural script for how to tell the story of someone truly great. This trope was so common that even the Samaritans were using it. And if the Samaritans were, then it's certainly not far-fetched to suggest that some Jews might have used it too. That's why when modern Christian apologists insist that the gospel writers must have believed the resurrection happened literally, because who would make up such a thing? It just shows they may not fully understand the cultural and literary environment of the time. As I've mentioned, the Gospels were written in Greek for Greek-speaking audiences, and in that world, Apotheosis, the idea of someone becoming divine after death, was the established language for honoring important figures. So it would make perfect sense for the Gospel writers to use the same narrative style to describe Jesus. They weren't doing something unheard of. They were following a familiar pattern shaped by the world they lived in. That doesn't mean Jesus' resurrection must be false. But it does mean that if we want to understand how Jesus' followers come to see him as divine, we have to recognize the world they were living in, a world where resurrection stories were part of the language people used to talk about gods, heroes, and the chosen ones. You might be thinking, but weren't the Jews strictly monotheistic? Wouldn't that make it hard for elements of Greek mythology to slip into their religion? It's a fair question. And to some extent, it's true. In Palestine, Judaism mostly resisted foreign influence and tried to maintain religious purity. But that wasn't the case everywhere. Hellenistic Jews and later Gentile Christians lived fully immersed in Greco-Roman culture. They were surrounded by its language, values, and ideas. And just like Judaism had been influenced by Zoroastrianism during the Persian period, it's not surprising that early Christianity, especially outside of Palestine, absorbed some of the thought patterns, language, and storytelling styles of the Greek world. In fact, it's a historical fact that Christianity didn't thrive in Palestine, where Jesus was born. It gained momentum elsewhere, especially in Greek-speaking regions. So it's simply unrealistic to think that early Christians weren't shaped by the Greek philosophy and mythology. That was the air they were breathing. Now, does any of this prove that Jesus' resurrection didn't happen? No, I don't think anyone can prove that either way. But let's imagine just for a moment that Jesus did die and stayed dead like every other human being. Could stories of his resurrection still have developed? Absolutely. If it was customary in the Greco-Roman world to honor their heroes and important figures by saying they conquered death and became immortal, it's not far-fetched to think that early Christians, especially those outside of Palestine, might have used the same kind of language to express their love, devotion, and reverence for Jesus. It doesn't require hallucinations. It doesn't require people to literally see a resurrected body. It just takes a cultural framework that already knows how to talk about death and glory in those terms. Of course, if you still believe Jesus truly rose from the dead, that's totally fine by me. But I'd be curious, do you also think the resurrection stories from Greek myths, like those of Romulus or Asclepius, might be historically true too? If not, why not? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to hear from you. In conclusion, if we want to understand how religious beliefs form and evolve, we need to look beyond isolated events and examine the cultural stories people were already telling. Belief doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It grows in the soil of existing ideas, hopes, and expectations. I spent a lot of time researching and putting this video together, and honestly, I feel like we have only scratched the surface of how Christian doctrines were shaped in the ancient world. If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, please drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss future videos like this. I'll be diving deeper into topics like this in the upcoming episodes. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.